Clara, a 9-month pregnant woman, was taken into custody after her boss accused her of theft. She was unjustly imprisoned while still carrying her unborn child. Years later, her boss discovered that the funds were actually misappropriated by his own offspring, but he attempted to conceal this revelation. Will the reality eventually be revealed, or will Clara remain forgotten within the prison walls? Watch the complete video to learn the outcome. Now let's delve into the full narrative. Clara's mornings commenced before the sun's rays fully extended over the dusty avenues of her small town. At 31 years of age, this woman shouldered the burden of adversity on her delicate frame, yet her eyes shone with an unwavering fortitude. Employed as a cleaner in a large edifice owned by Mr. Cyrus, she labored tirelessly, resolved to offer even the slightest ray of optimism for her future. More valuable than any tangible item was the existence developing within her, a pledge of revitalization that she cherished with gentle visions of an improved tomorrow. Each day, Clara entered the grand lobby of Mr. Cyrus's building, the opulence a stark contrast to her simple clothing and unassuming manner. The expansive marble floors and sparkling chandeliers depicted a scene of wealth and influence, elements that Clara could only observe with both wonder and a quiet acceptance of her position in the world. Within the vast corridors of the edifice, Clara became a silent observer of the dynamics of the powerful Mr. Cyrus, a 55-year-old billionaire whose presence radiated authority. He frequently traversed the halls with an air of superiority. His words, though rarely addressed to Clara, carried a tone that suggested entitlement and disdain for those who did not share his sphere. Even in his brief interactions with his staff, there was an unmistakable chasm between affluence and poverty, a divide that Clara felt acutely with every sweeping motion of her mop. Clara's days were characterized by a meticulous adherence to duty and a quiet awareness of the secrets the building harbored. Whispers and hushed dialogues filled the spaces between offices, and though Clara was expected to remain unseen, her keen sense of observation often captured fragments of discussions that hinted at corruption and concealed motives. She recalled once overhearing a conversation about a missing sum of money, a detail she dismissed at the time as merely another rumor circulating within the gilded corridors of authority. Yet, as fate would soon demonstrate, these fragments of truth were pieces of a puzzle far larger than she could have ever conceived. The workplace itself, with its polished surfaces and concealed corners, became a character in Clara's life, a silent observer of her struggles and quiet dignity. Each morning, as she donned her uniform, she felt a blend of apprehension and resolve, knowing that her small acts of perseverance were her own way of fighting against an inequitable world. One particularly humid afternoon, while Clara meticulously cleaned near the private offices of Mr. Cyrus, she noticed subtle indications of strain among the staff. Eyes darted nervously, hushed voices carried a weight beyond the ordinary day, and in the background, the unmistakable aura of something amiss loomed. Although Clara had no role in the inner workings of the building's hierarchy, little did she know that her quiet diligence and unyielding spirit would soon draw her into a vortex of injustice, a vortex that would alter the trajectory of her life and that of her beloved Walter forever. It was on a seemingly unremarkable morning that the delicate equilibrium of Clara's life was irrevocably shattered. As she commenced her shift with the same unwavering dedication, an unexpected chill swept through the corridors. Whispers of accusations and hurried exchanges reached her ears, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Clara, who had always been known for her quiet dependability and spotless record, found herself suddenly thrust into a maelstrom of suspicion. The source of this upheaval was none other than Mr. Cyrus himself, a man whose standing in the building and in the community was founded on wealth and a reputation that bordered on unassailable. The day unfolded with a disquieting swiftness. In the midst of her routine cleaning near the main entrance, Clara was abruptly summoned into the sparsely furnished cold office of Mr. Cyrus. The man, with a stern expression etched on his face, wasted no time in confronting her with accusations that struck like lightning. "Clara," he began, his tone laced with a venomous blend of anger and disbelief. "Someone has stolen $30,000 from the company, and all evidence points to you." The words, heavy and accusatory, fell upon her like a blow. In that instant, the warmth of her world, her love for Walter, and the hope for her unborn child seemed to vanish behind a curtain of terror and confusion. Clara's heart pounded as she stammered out her protestations of innocence, her voice trembling in the cold silence of the office. She pleaded with Mr. Cyrus, explaining that her daily routines were far removed from any opportunity for theft, that she had nothing to gain from such an act of treachery. Yet, the more vehemently she argued, the more Mr. Cyrus's gaze hardened, as though he were resolved to seal her fate regardless of her pleas. The accusation was not merely a claim of misconduct. It was a sentence of ostracism, a declaration that she was undeserving of trust or compassion. As she was escorted out of the office in a mixture of contempt and cold formality, Clara's thoughts turned to Walter and the baby she carried. How would they cope with this sudden betrayal by fate? In that crushing moment, as she was forced to confront the bitter reality of her situation, a deep sense of injustice took root in her soul. The accusation was not only an affront to her character, but a dark omen that promised to upend the very... In the wake of the damning accusation, Clara found herself facing a trial that seemed as predetermined as the rising sun. The courtroom was a stark, intimidating space, its cold walls and austere decor a cruel contrast to the passionate pleas of the accused. 9 months pregnant and carrying the burden of an unfounded charge, Clara entered the courtroom with a fragile hope that truth might yet prevail. The air was thick with tension as onlookers and officials exchanged sidelong glances and whispers, a constant murmur of judgment in a world that had already decided her fate. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting its case against her. Evidence, circumstantial and manipulated, was paraded before the judge with an unsettling certainty. Clara's voice, small yet clear, trembled as she recounted her daily routine, the meticulous care with which she performed her duties, and the unlikelihood of her involvement in any criminal act. Yet every word seemed to fall on deaf ears, drowned out by the weight of assumptions and prejudice that had already taken root. The courtroom's atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken consensus. The poor cleaner, with her unassuming demeanor and simple life, was suddenly the embodiment of a betrayal so inexplicable that no one could fathom its reversal. Her defense argued fervently that there was a possibility of error, that haste and assumptions had clouded the judgment of those who were meant to uphold justice. Walter, who sat in the gallery with tear-streaked cheeks and a heart full of anguish, clutched a worn photograph of the two of them in happier times. His presence was a silent testament to the love and integrity that defined their lives, a stark contrast to the accusation that now threatened to dismantle everything they had built together. The judge's stern gaze never wavered, but beneath it, Clara could sense a flicker of doubt, a small hope that perhaps the scales of justice might yet tip in her favor. However, the ruling came with a cold finality that shattered any remnants of hope. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Clara was sentenced to 3 years in jail. The sentence, delivered in a monotone that left no room for emotion, felt like a death knell for the life she had so lovingly envisioned. The courtroom, once a space where justice was supposed to reign, had instead become a stage for the cruel display of power and prejudice. As she was led away in handcuffs, the murmurs of the onlookers transformed from disbelief to quiet resignation, a collective surrender to an injustice that seemed too deep to challenge. In the silent moments after the sentencing, as Clara was ushered through the heavy doors of the prison, the reality of her situation set in with brutal clarity. The cold, hard walls of her new temporary home loomed before her, a physical manifestation of the separation that now divided her from Walter and the unborn child who was the only beacon of light in her darkening world. The finality of the sentence was not just a punishment, it was a severance of bonds, a forced separation of a family whose love had been their only defense against the world's cruelty. As the prison gates closed behind her, Clara's mind raced with thoughts of Walter's despair of a baby waiting in the world outside for a mother who could no longer be there to comfort them. The echoes of her protests in the courtroom were replaced by the silence of confinement, each moment a stark reminder of the injustice she was forced to endure. In that bleak corridor between hope and despair, Clara vowed silently that she would survive this ordeal. Even as the cold hand of fate gripped her heart, the ember of hope that burned within refused to be extinguished. Every painful step into the unknown was a testament to her strength, a promise that one day truth would prevail, and the bonds of love would reunite her with the family she so dearly missed. The transition from the sterile, unfeeling halls of the courtroom to the grim reality of the prison was as abrupt as it was brutal. Within moments, Clara found herself enveloped in a world of harsh concrete walls, echoing footsteps, and the ever-present scent of despair. The prison was a labyrinth of cold corridors and barred windows, where every turn whispered tales of lost hope and broken dreams. Here, her status as a pregnant woman, 9 months along, made her both an anomaly and a subject of pity among fellow inmates. Yet, beneath the layers of sympathy, there was an unspoken understanding that in this place, vulnerability was a luxury no one could afford. From her first day in confinement, Clara was forced to confront the isolation that came with the loss of freedom. In a cell that was scarcely more than a concrete box, she was left with her own thoughts, the echo of a past life, filled with laughter and shared dreams with Walter, was now replaced by an overwhelming sense, Walter's voice, for the feeling of his hand in hers. The silence of her cell was deafening, amplifying the ache in her heart. She yearned for the day she could hold her child in her arms, nurture them, and protect them from the harsh realities of the world. The prison walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with their cold indifference. She tried to focus on the future, on the day she would be released, on the reunion with her family. But the uncertainty of that future weighed heavily on her soul. Would Walter still be waiting for her? Would their child know her? Would they be able to rebuild the life that had been so cruelly taken from them? These questions haunted her waking hours and filled her dreams with nightmares. The prison, with its rigid routines and constant surveillance, became a microcosm of the world outside, a world that had judged her unfairly and condemned her without mercy. She felt like a prisoner, not just of the state but of her own circumstances, trapped in a web of injustice that seemed impossible to escape. Yet even in the darkest moments, a flicker of hope remained. The thought of her child, the promise of new life kept her going. She clung to that hope like a lifeline, a beacon in the darkness. She knew that she had to survive not just for herself, but for her child, for Walter, for the family that had been torn apart by a false accusation. She would endure. She would persevere. And she would fight for the truth, for justice, for the chance to reclaim her life and her family. Walter's comforting voice, and for the soft coos of the baby who, despite being born in such a harsh setting, symbolized hope. With every passing hour, the memory of happier times became both a source of strength and a painful reminder of what had been lost. The stark reality of the prison was unyielding, a constant barrage of cold interactions, enforced routines, and the relentless pressure to conform to an environment that cared little for the individual tragedies hidden behind each face. In the midst of this desolation, Clara resolved to hold on to the spark of hope that had sustained her through so much adversity. Each night, as she lay on her hard cot in the dark silence of her cell, she would imagine a future where the chains of injustice were broken and where love and truth would triumph over cruelty. Even in the oppressive gloom, the memory of Walter's gentle smile and the thought of the baby who represented the possibility of a brighter tomorrow gave her the strength to endure. In that lonely cell, far from the life she once knew, Clara's spirit remained defiant, a quiet promise that she would survive, that the injustice she faced was not the end, but the beginning of a story that demanded to be rewritten with courage, determination, and ultimately, redemption. In a place where hope was a rare and precious commodity, an unexpected miracle began to blossom. Just 5 days after her sentencing, the sterile corridors of the prison were filled with an air of both tension and quiet awe. Clara, whose body had been silently enduring the strain of confinement while carrying the weight of her unborn child, was suddenly faced with the most intimate and life-altering event of her existence, a labor that would bring forth a new life amidst the coldest of circumstances. The transformation began on a night when the usual silence of the cell block was punctuated by soft, urgent whispers and the distant shuffle of guards. Clara's body, weakened by stress yet driven by the primal force of life, betrayed subtle signs that the time had come. In the dim light of a small barred window, she clutched a faded photograph of Walter, a talisman of love and strength, while summoning the courage to face the unknown. With each contraction that rippled through her, there was a mixture of excruciating pain and profound determination. It was as if every pang was a declaration that even in the depths of injustice and confinement, the miracle of life could not be silenced. The prison infirmary, typically a space of routine medical care, was transformed for those few precious hours into a sanctuary of fragile hope. A compassionate nurse, moved by Clara's plight and the raw intensity of the moment, provided all the comfort and assistance she could muster. In an environment where strict protocols usually left little room for empathy, this nurse's gentle presence became a beacon of humanity. With careful, practiced hands and a kind smile, she helped Clara navigate the storm of pain and fear, whispering reassurances that echoed the hope of a new beginning. As hours bled into one another, the harsh reality of the prison walls faded into the background, replaced by the singular focus on the miracle unfolding before everyone's eyes. In a moment that seemed both surreal and tender, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. His cry, piercing and pure, reverberated through the sterile corridors like a promise that even in the darkest of places, life would find a way to assert itself. In that instant, the cold confines of the prison were momentarily transformed into a sanctuary of love and possibility, a fleeting but powerful reminder that human resilience could defy even the most oppressive circumstances. The atmosphere in the infirmary shifted from one of clinical detachment to raw emotion. Guards, usually stoic in their duty, paused to watch this miracle with expressions that betrayed their own hidden tenderness. In the eyes of the nurse and a few compassionate onlookers, there was a shared understanding that Clara's child was more than just a new life. It was a symbol of hope in a world that had seemed intent on crushing her spirit. Every tiny cry, every delicate movement resonated as a testament to the indomitable force of life and the enduring power of hope. Even as the physical pain receded, Clara was overwhelmed by a profound sense of loss and separation. She knew that the circumstances of her imprisonment meant that she could not hold her son for long. The bittersweet reality of that knowledge mingled with the joy of his arrival, leaving her with a deep, aching sorrow. Yet, even in that sorrow, there was a spark of fierce determination, a resolve that no matter the distance or the injustice, she would fight to reunite with him. In that small, sterile room, surrounded by cold metal and harsh lights, a new chapter of hope had begun, and with it, the promise that love would eventually bridge the gap between confinement and freedom. In the fragile hours that followed the miracle of birth, a profound and wrenching decision loomed over Clara, a choice that would forever alter the course of her life and that of her newborn son. With the walls of the infirmary still echoing with his first cries, Clara's heart was torn between the joy of welcoming life and the crushing reality of her ongoing sentence. The weight of separation pressed down on her, and in a moment of unbearable clarity, she understood that she could not remain with her child in confinement. For the sake of his future and his well-being, she resolved to entrust him to the only person who could provide him with the nurturing care he so desperately needed, her beloved husband, Walter. The decision was not made lightly. In the quiet moments after his birth, as nurses wrapped the tiny bundle in soft blankets and the echoes of his cries began to subside, Clara's eyes welled up with tears that carried a silent promise, a promise of eventual reunion and a vow that this temporary separation was only a pause in the long narrative of their love. She clutched a small, worn locket that Walter had given her on a day filled with hope, and with trembling fingers, she signed the necessary documents that would transfer temporary custody of her son to him. The legal process, rushed and cold, felt like another act of cruelty imposed by a system that cared little for the intricacies of a mother's heart. Walter, waiting outside the infirmary in the dim light of a cold afternoon, was a portrait of quiet anguish. When the nurse stepped out with news that his son's custody was being handed over to him, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and overwhelming sorrow. In that moment, the distance between hope and despair, blurred with every step he took toward the infirmary, was heavy with the knowledge that his new role as both father and sole guardian was a task he had not chosen, but one he would embrace with unwavering determination. Meeting Clara's eyes one last time before the formalities were completed, the two exchanged a silent farewell, a look that conveyed a multitude of emotions: love, regret, and the promise of eventual reunion. As Walter cradled their newborn son in his strong, calloused arms, the air around them seemed to shimmer with a bittersweet realization of what had been sacrificed. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Walter's hand, as if seeking comfort and reassurance in a world that had suddenly grown vast and uncertain. The bittersweet moment etched itself into both Clara and Walter's souls, a reminder that love, though tested by separation and injustice, could endure even the harshest of trials. In that heart-wrenching goodbye, as Walter walked away with the newborn safely cradled in his arms, the silent corridors of the prison seemed to whisper of future reunions and the relentless hope that one day the family would be whole again. With every step taken and every tear shed, both parents vowed to keep the flame of love burning despite the darkness that now loomed large between them. Back in the modest confines of their humble home, the absence of Clara was a constant, aching presence. Walter, a skilled carpenter with hands weathered by years of labor, now carried the weight of a new responsibility that surpassed the physical demands of his craft. Each morning, as he rose to the sound of a creaking floor and the chirping of distant birds, he was met with a silent reminder of the baby nestled in a battered crib, a living symbol of hope and a future that had suddenly become both his and his child's to protect. Walter's days were now a careful balancing act of work, fatherhood, and an ever-present longing for Clara's comforting presence. The workshop, where he carved delicate designs from wood, became his sanctuary, a place where he could pour his heart into every stroke of the chisel, every careful assembly of pieces that would one day form something beautiful and lasting. Yet even as he labored over his craft, the specter of loneliness loomed large. Late into the night, by the flickering light of a single lamp, he would cradle the baby close and murmur soft lullabies, a blend of old folk songs and improvised verses born out of a love that transcended despair. In these quiet moments, the baby's soft coos and the rhythmic tapping of Walter's hammer on wood merged into a symphony of determination and hope. With each gentle pat on the baby's back, Walter's resolve grew stronger. In the silence of her cell, every heartbeat was a quiet reminder that despite the cruelty of fate, she was still the mother of a child who represented hope, and a woman capable of transforming even the darkest moments into the seeds of a brighter future. With each passing day, the whispers of resilience grew louder, a soft but persistent promise that the injustice that had marred her life was not the end of her story, but merely the prelude to a grander narrative of love, retribution, and eventual liberation. 2 years into Clara's unjust imprisonment, in the opulent corridors of Mr. Cyrus's grand estate, the world outside continued its relentless march of time, unaware of the seeds of truth that had been quietly sown. Mr. Cyrus, whose very name had come to embody both immense wealth and an iron-fisted approach to control, began to notice inconsistencies in the narrative he had so carefully constructed. In the hushed corners of his sprawling office, where decisions were made with a swift and unyielding certainty, whispers of doubt crept in regarding the missing $30,000, a sum that had been the catalyst for Clara's tragic downfall. Late one evening, as Mr. Cyrus pored over accounts and ledgers, he stumbled upon a series of discrepancies that defied explanation. The numbers, once neatly aligned with the expectations of his vast empire, now betrayed a pattern of misappropriation that could not be easily dismissed. It was in this moment of quiet scrutiny that he discovered evidence suggesting that the theft was not the act of a humble cleaner, but a calculated maneuver orchestrated by none other than his own son Damien. Shock and indignation mingled in Mr. Cyrus's mind as he realized that the very foundation of his authority was being undermined by a betrayal that ran deeper than any mere act of theft. The discovery was both a relief and a curse. While it cleared the name of the poor, innocent Clara, a truth that had long been buried beneath layers of prejudice and arrogance, it also exposed a scandal that could rock the very pillars of Mr. Cyrus's empire. Torn between a desire to correct the injustice and the instinct to protect his reputation, he found himself caught in a web of conflicting loyalties. The thought of having to admit that his own flesh and blood had committed the crime filled him with a dread that rivaled the deepest regrets of his past. In the days that followed, Mr. Cyrus attempted a desperate cover-up, using his considerable influence to suppress the emerging truth. Meetings were held in private, and orders were given with an urgency that betrayed his internal panic. Yet, even as he scrambled to manipulate the narrative in his favor, one of his own workers, a man of quiet integrity who had long harbored doubts about the ruthless methods employed by his employer, could no longer remain silent. This worker, whose conscience had been burdened by the injustice inflicted on Clara, gathered the necessary evidence and approached the authorities with a confession that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of power. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Rumors of corruption and cover-ups began to ripple through the halls of power, and the whispered truth spread like wildfire among those who had long questioned the ethics of Mr. Cyrus's methods. In the quiet isolation of his luxurious office, Mr. Cyrus felt the walls closing in around him, as if the very structure of his empire was crumbling under the weight of his deception. The discovery of his son's involvement was not just a personal betrayal. It was a seismic shift that threatened to upend the status quo. For Clara, even, behind the oppressive bars of her cell, the faint stirrings of justice provided a small measure of solace. Though she remained unaware of the full extent of the scandal unfolding outside, there was a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the truth was beginning to surface. Every detail uncovered about Damien's culpability, was a silent vindication of her innocence, a promise that the relentless march of time and truth would eventually bring justice to those who had suffered at the hands of a corrupt system. In the corridors of power, where secrets were guarded with ruthless determination, a solitary act of courage began to ripple through the silence like a clarion call. The worker who had long observed the machinations of Mr. Cyrus with a heavy heart found that the burden of guilt had grown too great to bear in silence. This man, whose name was scarcely known outside the confines of his daily labor, had witnessed firsthand the subtle maneuvers that concealed his employer's misdeeds. With every passing day, as he observed the unjust treatment of those on the fringes of society, including the innocent Clara, his conscience screamed for resolution. Late one chilly evening, after a long day of toiling in the shadows of the grand estate, the worker gathered every scrap of evidence he could find. A series of documents, internal memos, and testimonies from trusted colleagues. Each piece told a part of the story: how the $200 had been siphoned off by Damien, how Mr. Cyrus had manipulated the narrative, and how an innocent life had been shattered in the process. With trembling resolve, he decided that the truth, no matter how dangerous, needed to be set free. The next morning, before the break of dawn, the worker made his way to a small, nondescript government office where a sympathetic official awaited his revelations. In a hushed, urgent tone, he recounted every detail of the cover-up, leaving no stone unturned. His confession was meticulous, a careful tapestry woven from threads of truth and personal risk. He knew that his actions could spell retribution, not only from Mr. Cyrus, but also from a network of powerful allies determined to keep the scandal under wraps. As the information was relayed to higher authorities, the corridors of the estate buzzed with a subtle tension. Investigators began to scrutinize the discrepancies in the financial records, and the once impenetrable fortress of secrecy that Mr. Cyrus had built began to show cracks. The revelation of Damien's involvement, corroborated by the whistleblower's evidence, spread through whispers and hurried phone calls among officials and aides alike. Every new piece of information was a nail in the coffin of the carefully constructed narrative that had wrongfully condemned Clara. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable, as if the very air was charged with a promise of imminent change. In that moment of reckoning, the worker's act of conscience transcended personal risk and became a symbol of integrity, a beacon for all who had suffered under the weight of corruption. His decision to speak out, to risk everything in the pursuit of truth, echoed far beyond the confines of his own life. It was a declaration that justice, though sometimes delayed, was an inevitable force that could not be silenced forever. In the wake of his testimony, as the investigation gathered momentum and the power structures began to shift, the worker remained an unsung hero. The day of reckoning arrived with a storm of headlines and whispered conversations that swept through both high society and the everyday lives of those touched by injustice. As the investigation into the missing $200 reached a crescendo, the evidence that had once been hidden in the shadows was now thrust into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The truth about Damien's involvement was laid bare for all to see, and the fallout was as immediate as it was dramatic. In the opulent halls of Mr. Cyrus's mansion, panic mingled with disbelief. The once unwavering billionaire found himself cornered by the relentless tide of evidence, with documents, testimonies, and undeniable proof gathered by the courageous whistleblower. The narrative he had so carefully curated began to crumble. His attempts to suppress the scandal were met with a force that no amount of wealth or influence could contain. The revelation was not only a personal betrayal, it was a public indictment of a system that had allowed injustice to fester in silence. Authorities, buoyed by the unassailable evidence, moved swiftly to arrest Damien. The news of his arrest rippled through the community like a shockwave, sending tremors of disbelief through those who had long questioned the fairness of the accusation leveled against Clara. For the poor cleaner and her estranged family, the revelation was a bittersweet vindication, a long-awaited acknowledgment that the injustice done to them was not only recognized but actively being corrected. As the details of the case were broadcast on television and discussed fervently in community gatherings, whispers of hope began to replace the murmurs of resignation. Inside the cold, oppressive walls of the prison, Clara felt a stirring of emotions that had long been dormant. The news, carried to her in halting, breathless whispers by a sympathetic guard, was a balm to a heart that had borne the weight of wrongful accusation for far too long. Every piece of evidence that pointed to Damien's guilt was a thread in a tapestry of redemption, a sign that the very system that had condemned her was now on the path to rectifying its mistake. Though the taste of freedom was still distant, Clara's spirit was buoyed by the promise that truth had finally found its voice. Walter, too, who had been weathering the storm of raising their son alone, found himself enveloped in a cautious optimism. The arrest of Damien was more than just a legal victory. It was a turning point that signified the eventual restoration of justice. In the quiet moments after receiving the news, Walter allowed himself to imagine a future where the scars of the past could begin to heal. A future where Clara might once again be free, and where their family could finally be whole. The public outcry following the revelation was fierce and unyielding. Demonstrations erupted outside the courthouse, and community leaders called for a thorough re-examination of cases where power had corrupted justice. In an ironic twist of fate, the very institution that had once been a tool of oppression was now a battleground for accountability. For Clara, the shattering revelation was a sign that her suffering had not been in vain, that every tear shed, every moment of despair, was a prelude to the eventual triumph of truth over deception. In the charged atmosphere of that fateful day, as Damien was led away in handcuffs and Mr. Cyrus struggled to salvage what remained of his crumbling empire, the wheels of justice turned inexorably. The evidence was irrefutable, and the call for reform grew louder by the minute. For Clara, the realization that the real culprit had been unmasked was a quiet victory, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of truth. In that moment, the dark shadows that had haunted her life began to recede, replaced by a cautious but genuine hope that the future held the promise of redemption and reconciliation. The aftermath of the scandal sent ripples through the corridors of power and into the everyday lives of those who had long suffered under its weight. With Damien's arrest and the damning evidence firmly in hand, Mr. Cyrus was left with no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The once mighty billionaire, whose wealth had been built on foundations of both ambition and questionable morality, found himself compelled to acknowledge the errors of his judgment. In a move that shocked the elite and resonated deeply with the common folk, his vast fortune was subjected to a division, an act meant to serve as both retribution and restitution. The decision was as dramatic as it was unprecedented. After heated negotiation and public outcry, the ruling authorities decreed that Mr. Cyrus's wealth be divided into 3 parts. In a symbolic gesture meant to right the wrongs of the past, 2 of these parts were awarded to Clara and Walter, a recognition of the injustice they had suffered, and a promise that their future would not be marred by the misdeeds of others. For 2 years, many had watched in silent solidarity as an innocent woman was punished for a crime she never committed. The decision to reallocate a significant portion of Mr. Cyrus's fortune was seen as a rare instance where the scales of justice were finally balanced. Public opinion, once laced with cynicism and resignation, now began to shift towards a cautious belief that even those entrenched in power could be held accountable. In a formal ceremony that was both somber and celebratory, the division of wealth was announced before a modest gathering of community leaders, legal representatives, and a few press members. Walter was charged with emotion as the names of Clara and himself were read out, their voices trembling with the weight of years of struggle. For the couple, it was a moment of both closure and the beginning of a long road to healing, a road paved with the promise of new opportunities and the hope that the wounds inflicted by past injustices might one day be fully mended. The decision also served as a powerful message to a society long accustomed to the abuse of power, that no one, regardless of wealth or influence, was above the law. In dividing the spoils of injustice, the system had, for the first time in a long while, taken a stand for those who had suffered silently. For Clara and Walter, the windfall was not just financial security. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the belief that the light of truth and resilience could ultimately triumph over even the darkest of betrayals. As the years in confinement slowly ticked away, Clara began to feel the subtle stirrings of change within her. The relentless passage of time, marked by the slow but sure progress of the justice that had finally been set in motion, brought with it moments of quiet introspection and hope. The day Clara had long envisioned finally arrived with a soft glow of dawn, gently dispelling the lingering shadows of a long and painful past. After 3 arduous years of wrongful imprisonment, the heavy iron doors that had once confined her were slowly pushed open, releasing not only a freed woman, but the promise of a long-awaited reunion. As Clara stepped out into the cool morning air, every heartbeat resonated with a mixture of cautious hope and unbridled emotion. The world outside, vibrant and alive, seemed to welcome her return, as though nature itself recognized the resilience of a spirit that had withstood unspeakable injustice. The journey back to a life once interrupted was fraught with overwhelming emotions. Clara's steps, though tentative at first, soon grew surer as she made her way toward the modest home that had long been a symbol of both struggle and enduring love. Every familiar sight, the crooked pathway lined with wildflowers, the worn wooden door with its fading paint, spoke of memories filled with laughter, sorrow, and the quiet strength of Walter, who had persevered in her absence. The news of the wealth division, which had begun to transform their lives from within, only added to the bittersweet symphony of emotions swirling within her. Inside that humble abode, Walter had been waiting with an anticipation that words could scarcely capture. Over the years, as he molded his craft with tireless determination and nurtured their newborn son into a symbol of hope, his heart had never ceased to long for the day of their reunion. When he finally caught sight of Clara emerging from the distance, time itself